That's right, my wife and I are expecting our second little kiddo, and it's a girl. I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom, and welcome to my newly remodeled nursery. So, this is our starting point. This is a pretty nice room. It's a good size, it just needs some updating. And this video will show how I turn this dreary room into a bright and fun nursery. Step 1 is always demolition. Get rid of the stuff that I don't want. I will be painting and replacing these doors, so I am careful when taking these off. This is a demonstration on how not to remove moldings. And here's the right way. It's always a good idea to cut the caulking between the molding and the drywall. This will help reduce or eliminate the paper tearing off of the drywall. After demo, it's time to move on to the first step of rebuilding the room, and that's the drywall. In this case, I'm going to put what's known as a level 5 surface finish onto my drywall, which is a perfectly smooth surface. And for this go-around, I tried a process that's new to me, where I thinned the mud a little bit, I rolled it on with a heavy nap roller, and I used a rubber squeegee to smooth it out flat. Overall, this is a pretty easy process. It just takes a lot of time. But I think it's time well spent. The perfectly smooth drywall surface adds a contemporary feel that just can't be achieved with any sort of spray-on or knock-down drywall texture. The shop apprentice is at an age where he is very interested in everything I do, so you'll see him quite a bit throughout the course of this video. So here's the second coat going on. I ended up applying 3 coats, and the surface was pretty smooth, but it did need some sanding. This is probably the 10th room that I've done with this same drywall treatment, and every time I promise myself I'll never do this again unless I have a power drywall sander. Yet here I am. After the sanding, I cleaned up real good, and then I threw up a quick coat of primer. After the walls are prepped and ready to go, I turn my attention to building a window seat. And since I want it to fit fairly accurately into this bay window, I make a template. And the template's great because it eliminates the need for measuring. I know that if I build the window seat to this template, it will fit this bay window just right. And I use this scribing tool from FastCap to help me draw a line. I set the width to the largest opening between my template piece and the wall, draw my line, cut right down to my line, and the piece fits perfectly. And for these cuts, I like a spoke shave, a small block plane, and if there's a lot of material to remove, I like to use a jigsaw. And a hot glue gun works better for this process, but I was all out of the glue cartridges. So now I've moved out to the shop and I've used the template to mark what will be the bottom of the window seat, and I'm making sure to cut on the inside of those lines so that I know that it will fit in the opening. Here I'm cutting the 4 vertical dividers and the 2 side pieces. Nice shot. I think that was from 3-point land. Now I'm just cutting some bevels on the left and right sides to match the bottom. And anytime I'm working with angles, I always find it best to mark directly from the workpiece versus trying to measure. And there it is, perfectly sized side piece. These pocket holes will eventually be used to hold the face frame on. Nothing fancy for joinery, just using the mighty screw. 1.75 in length, which is my standard cabinet assembly screw, along with a properly sized countersink bit. In an attempt to keep weight down, I used a couple poplar stretchers for the top. And this sucker was heavy. I was forced to use MDF for the bottom because it's a little over 8 feet and my supplier only sells 10-foot material in MDF. Alright, here's a pro tip. Anytime you're driving a screw into MDF, do not put the screw too close to the edge, because even if you use the properly sized countersink bit, the MDF will split. So move back in somewhere around 1.5 to 2 inches and the splitting will not be a problem. Once the box was screwed together, I turned my attention to making a face frame. When dealing with really long face frame material, as I am here, that's 3/4 inch thick, I don't bother jointing it. I would end up losing too much thickness trying to achieve a straight edge. So I just plane it to a consistent thickness, then I build it into the face frame. When I attach it to the cabinet, it will become nice and flat. After milling up the parts and collecting the necessary tools, I assemble the face frame. I always think it's a good idea to glue face frames together even though I'm using pocket holes, but I think it's especially important on a real narrow piece where I could only get one pocket hole. For little parts like this, I find it best to mark directly from the project versus trying to measure. And next I add a couple of biscuits just for alignment, in this case during glue up, and this will greatly reduce the chances that glue up turns into a cluster fornication. And I feel like I'm working out of order here. I put the biscuit slots in and then I'm going back to finish up the face frames. I probably was just on autopilot and not thinking. Yes, nice work. So the song recommendation for this video comes with an embarrassing story. I was listening to one of my guilty pleasures, and that is Taylor Swift's Shake It Off. And I'll admit I was singing, and in fact I was probably doing a little more than singing. I was actually shaking it off. And I turned around and the propane delivery guy was standing there in the door of my shop, and I don't know how long he'd been watching for, but he had an interesting look on his face. So my question for you, what are your favorite guilty pleasure songs? Be brave, let us know in the comments section below.
Mom, play with it. Oh, that's cool.
Back in the house, I decided I wanted to put a small built-in into this bump out. And I knew that the vent for our heater was in here, and I also knew that there was some plumbing in here. The question was, how deep would I be able to make the cabinet? After cutting the opening, I was pleasantly surprised to find that I could stick a 6-inch deep cabinet in this opening and still maintain more than the 1-inch minimum clearance to this vent pipe. Building a little itty-bitty cabinet like this one, it takes a ton of time. I mean, it requires all the same steps that a much larger cabinet would require. But I think it's time well spent. Details like this make a room feel real special and one of a kind. Anytime I'm building a cabinet with a bunch of fixed shelves and I'm going to be attaching a face frame, I always like to cut the joinery on those face frame members first and get those pieces positioned accurately. And it's important to take into account the different offsets needed for the shelves versus the top and bottom. Each requires a different setup of the biscuit joiner. Once all the fixed shelf face frame members are accurately placed, I can clamp the sides on and mark for my next joinery cuts. And in this case, I'm going to be using the Festool Domino because my pieces are just about a ½ inch, which is too thin for my pocket hole machine. So pocket holes are out. Next best option is the Domino. And for as much as I love my biscuit joiner, the Festool Domino has one distinct advantage, and that is it can cut joinery in a much narrower piece. Biscuits, glue, and a handful of clamps is my method for attaching the face frame to the cabinet. And I use glue and staples to attach the back. Lastly, I add a small 1/8 inch round over to the inside and outside edges, and I do some hand sanding. At this point, the two built-in projects are completed. They are patiently awaiting primer, so I head back into the house and I work on the windowsills. And for whatever reason, I find it challenging to calculate the width of the sills. I'm still working on this new fandangled thing they call math. And I'm sure there are a million ways to make these cuts, but in this case I grabbed a small handsaw and I was able to make the cuts right there on site next to the windows. And in some cases, a little scribing was necessary. After the sills were fitted nicely, I go ahead and work on the rest of the window and door casings. These are real simple flat pieces with a small round over on the outside edges. The left and right pieces are 3 1/4 inches wide and 3/4 to 13/16 thick. The headers are 4 1/2 inches wide and they're like 7/8, 15/16 inches thick. As per usual, I'm bouncing around between the jointer and the bandsaw to make these parts. And as you can see in this shot, I'm experimenting with an outfeed table on my bandsaw, which I'm really liking so far. One of the many reasons I like to do my ripping at the bandsaw versus the table saw is I like to leave this EdgeTech sanding disc set up in my table saw as much as possible. And I find it very convenient if I make a mistake or need to cut another part, I can just jump over to the bandsaw, rip a new part out, then hit it real quick on the table saw, and I'm back in business. And all parts get a 1/8 inch round over on the outside edges. So I ended up buying the base molding, which you're looking at here. Even though it's just a flat piece with a simple round over on the top, it makes more sense to buy it because the lumber yards cherry pick the 16-foot sticks of wood that are clear. For this project, I decided to go with solid wood moldings versus my normal MDF moldings. And one of the downsides to using solid wood moldings is they need to be sanded and then they need to be primed. This adds a fair amount of labor to a project like this. After 2 coats of primer and a little more sanding, it's now time for installation. After careful measuring and marking, I cut the pieces to length using a Cat's Moses dovetail jig. So the cool thing about this jig is one of the faces is actually just a 90-degree cut, so I use it to get the cut started, and then I just finish it off by hand. And since I only have a few of these to do, it makes sense to cut them by hand. I didn't feel like setting up a chop saw. I'm not sure it's totally necessary, but for whatever reason, I like to install the windowsills with a little construction adhesive. Oh yeah, and at some point I added some biscuit slots to help hold the left and right pieces in place. While I was taking final measurements for the headers, I kept feeling a breeze hitting my arms. So I decided to go ahead and pull out the fiberglass insulation, which I was going to do anyway, and put some polyurethane foam in, and here is what I was greeted with. And I'm not super in love with the idea of replacement windows anyway, but combine that with a really cheap previous homeowner who's looking for the cut rate window install guys, and this is what you get. So this spring, when it's warm enough, I'll head out there and add some caulking there to fill in those gaps. And in the meantime, I put some expanding polyurethane foam in there, and that should at least reduce the drafts. So once the expanding foam was done expanding, I proceeded to install the window moldings. Using biscuits to install moldings like this is not totally necessary. Nails and glue work just fine. With that said, I think that there are a couple advantages of using biscuits. One, it allows me to use fewer nails, which is always a good thing. The less patching I have to do, the better. And two is, I think it helps with alignment. If any of these moldings are twisted relative to the other ones, it detracts from the overall look. Biscuits ensure that things are aligned really nicely. And lastly, biscuits and glue help prevent any of the seams from opening up years down the line. And if you don't have a biscuit joiner or you don't feel like using it, pocket holes actually work great for this. I've had real good success just assembling the moldings as one large piece and then tacking them up with a couple of nails. Next, I move on to installing the crown molding. There are a few key tips needed to have good results when installing crown molding. The first is accurate measuring. And I find that using a piece of wood that's a known length, making a mark on the wall, then measuring from the opposite corner is a great way to get good measurements, especially if you're working alone. I measure the crown molding and base molding at the same time using the same method, and I take copious notes with my excellent penmanship. The next two key tips revolve around the chop saw setup. I think it's important to have some stops that hold the crown molding at the proper spring angle and some sort of outfeed, be it a miter saw station like this one or just some simple outfeed rollers, but I think having work support is very important. And the last tip, I like to get my thinking straight, and by that I mean I always like to remind myself that the bottom of the crown molding is facing up while cutting, and if you're cutting an inside miter, the bottom of the crown molding is longer. If you're cutting an outside miter, the top of the crown molding is longer. Once all the parts are cut, I carefully take them upstairs without denting or nicking any walls, and I begin installation. I like to start with the longest piece first, and I kind of get it temporarily held in place, and then I use an off-cut piece with a sample miter cut to adjust, twist, or roll the crown molding to get it exactly where I want it. Once I have both corners adjusted, I nail that piece up, and I remove my temporary supports.
And I blame you. No one knows but it's I.
And I like to add glue to both sides of the joint.
To me.
Shut up. Once I feel I've applied sufficient glue and I'm done singing, I use what's known as a third hand, that's the red tool in the corner, to put one end of the crown molding on, and then I use what's known as zip walls, that's the other tools, to temporarily hold the crown molding in place while I nail it up. And since we have rounded corners on the drywall in our house, I like to use a double miter versus a single 45-degree miter, which would create a little gap at the bottom. After installing the crown molding, I felt like I needed an easy win, so I decided to go ahead and screw this small built-in in place. Anytime I know I'm going to scribe a cabinet to fit a wall, I always leave a little extra overhang on the face frame for this exact reason, so I have some material to cut away. Installing a built-in on top of carpet is always a tricky proposition. If you cut the carpet away, then you have to have tack strips put in and have the carpet restretched. This is kind of a pain in the rear end. So here's another solution that works pretty good. I use some blocking to screw right down through the carpet into the subfloor. Then I screw through that blocking into the toe kick, and this locks everything in place. One cool thing about doing it this way as well, if I ever wanted to take this built-in out, at least there would still be carpet there versus just a big hole in the flooring. After wrestling the cabinet in place, I screwed it to the wall, used 3 or 4 screws. I ended up not screwing it down to the toe kick, I just didn't feel like it was necessary. And it passes the sit test, so you know it's good to go. And the last piece of the puzzle is to install the base molding. And early the next morning we had a blizzard blow in. At this point everything's installed. Now it's time to do some prep work. In between caulking, filling nail holes, and sanding, I probably spend about as much time on prep as I do installing moldings in the first place. After prep, I clean the room real good and mask off for paint. And since I'm going to be applying a spray finish to the moldings and built-ins, everything needs to be masked off real good. Now that the room is all masked, I'd like to go over the gear that I'm going to use for this spray job. And a box fan on low with the filter helps remove overspray. And the paint I'm going to be using is called Cabinet Coat. It's an acrylic urethane. It dries nice and hard. It's not gummy, so it's perfect for trim and built-ins. Gotta have a respirator and earmuffs so I can listen to tunes while I work. I'll be using a 4-stage turbine powering an HVLP spray gun. This is called a pressure pot. The paint goes in here. The paint is forced up this tube via compressed air. This is a great tool to have. It avoids the hassle of having to refill the cup gun. Plus, the spray gun itself is smaller and can fit into tighter spaces because the cup isn't on the gun. Here's where the rubber meets the road, or I guess the paint meets the air. Here's a good old-fashioned HVLP spray gun. And a 3-plug extension cord is a must, one for the compressor, one for the fan, and one for the turbine. And of course, a brush and roller always come in handy. So even though I don't have a cup on my spray gun, I still can't quite get it into these openings to spray. So I start by painting in behind the front edge of the face frame, and then I finish it off with the spray gun. And I brush a thin coat about 1 inch or 2 away from that edge of the face frame. HVLP is certainly not a real fast way to spray paint. It's certainly not as fast as using an airless, but it is easier to control. It's much easier to start and stop, and I think the end result is absolutely excellent. And I have a small handheld airless spray gun that I've used in a previous video, and I chose not to use it on this project because of having to paint all the inside nooks and crannies of the built-in. I'm just not good enough with an airless to get a good result. And I find that if I thin down one of the modern trim paints like Chem Aqua from Sherwin-Williams or Cabinet Coat, I get a pretty good result spraying with HVLP. I don't think I'd want to spray a whole house this way, but it works for smaller projects like this. After the paint was dry, it was time to clean up and remove all the masking. And the last task on the list is to make the cushion for the window seat. Super simple construction. I use biscuits and glue and a couple of screws to clamp everything together while the glue is drying. And here's where that template that I made earlier really comes in handy. I trace it onto the frame and cut it out, so now I know this will fit perfectly in the opening. I add some webbing. And I had a combination of jute webbing and elastic webbing that I needed to get rid of, so I did a mix. I use indoor-outdoor carpet as a barrier between the webbing and the foam. I add a layer of batting and wrap the whole thing in a nice pink fabric. After installing the cushion and reinstalling the doors and a few other small details, I put together a couple pieces of furniture, I clean up, and this room is ready to go. I wish I was as ready for our next little kiddo's arrival as this room is. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you liked the end result. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Till next time.